So welcome back to today's video. Today is Friday, November 1st, 2024, and today we are going to be taking a look at the 2024 presidential election based on what the polling data says 4 days out from the 2024 cycle. Now, I'll be doing a conclusive video the day before the election, compiling the averages of every single battleground state, all the polls and what they dictate across the 50 states, and what we can expect to see based on the only data we have predicting this cycle when it comes down to head-to-head matchups. Now, on your screen right now, you are looking at the 2024 election forecast from FiveThirtyEight, which hasn't changed too much over the past 2 weeks. It's been pretty consistent. They believe the former president Donald Trump is on track for victory, but it's not a substantial victory. It's 52-48, and it really is anybody's game. But FiveThirtyEight, luckily, does averages for us across a number of battleground states. They take a look at what the polls really say, and they average it and give us results as to what we can expect using these data points in the head-to-head situation, the same way we do on the forecast, and we also do on the national numbers. Now, on your screen now, we have a 2024 Electoral College map. What I've decided to do in this moment is characterize all of the states that we already know how they're going to go. So I'm not going to waste your time looking at polls from Kentucky and Oregon and New York because, plainly put, we know how these states are going to go. It's a waste of time. You're really here for the substantial swing states and really the competitive nature of them according to swing state polls. And so on your screen right now, we are going to spend the next, however long to allocate 214 electoral votes based on margin of victory based on what the polls predict. And so, for instance, an example of what this margin of victory can be, it's in the description box down below. But a tilt state is a state decided by 0.1% to 1%. A lean state is 1 to 5, and you'll see that as a lighter blue. A likely state is 5 to 15, and then a safe state is 15 points plus. Now, as you can expect, there are no states on this map that are yet to be characterized that will be considered safe. At most, they will be likely states. So we're really getting down to the nitty-gritty as to what states are competitive, how they're competitive, what the margins say, where Democrats and Republicans really excel across the map, and what it says for the overall election cycle. So, 214 electoral votes. Let's go ahead and get through it. Now, the first set of polls we have seen conducted across the map, we're going to work in a way that isn't focused on the 7 core battleground states at first. So throw out all of your expectations about those states right now. Let's look at the surrounding states and what the margins tell us there. We're going to start off in the state of Ohio. Now, Ohio, you might remember if you're an election junkie, how competitive it used to be, but Donald Trump is running exactly where he was back in 2020, and it actually is quite eerie to see just how similar those margin in. In 2020, Trump won Ohio by 8 points. In 2016, Trump won Ohio by 8.1%. Today, Donald Trump holds that 2016-2020 margin, 8.1% across the state. Donald Trump the clear advantage in that, which is quite interesting, if you ask me. Now moving over, the next big one that we're talking about is Texas. Donald Trump holds a 7-point advantage. I'm really going to try to steamroll through some of these more likely states so we can spend a lot of time talking about swing states. But Texas right now, actually an improvement off the 2020 margin, but a reduction from 2016, if that means anything for you. So really interesting to see Ohio on par with 16, Texas underperforming 16, but better than 20. So really interesting to see where we are right now. Virginia, Kamala Harris holds a 7-point lead in that state. No real surprise there. Democrats invested a lot in 2020, invested a lot in 16, invested nothing in 2024. So makes a bit of sense that you're seeing some reduction in support across the state. But we will see, because maybe it's an indicator of a larger trend line here that Kamala Harris is underperforming that of President Biden compared to 2020, as she has thus far in Ohio, Texas, and Virginia. Now, moving over to the next state is the state of New Mexico. No real shock here. Kamala Harris holds a 7-point advantage. Another state that Democrats invested in twice in 16 and 2020, did not invest in 2024. It's interesting to watch some of these states that Democrats knew they had some room to fall, right? It would be near impossible for Republicans to make up the double-digit victories that Democrats had in both of these states. And so maybe that contributed to the reason why Democrats didn't invest in these states the same way. They didn't visit these states the same way, didn't put ads out, volunteer bases, field offices, X, Y, and Z. If they lose the election, though, they might reflect on it and say, maybe we should have, or maybe not, actually. Maybe if they are able to win some states that, and it ends up being that New Mexico and Virginia end up suddenly shifting in the state legislative races or statewide races, don't benefit Democrats. They might do some reflection on that point. But honestly speaking, right now, New Mexico, Virginia, still in line in terms of characterization as to where they were in 2020. The next big state is the state of Florida, where Donald Trump holds a 6.5% advantage. Now, earlier on in the cycle, he held a 4-point lead, 3-point lead. Things have gotten better for Donald Trump. We've started to see an uptick in some of these states. Now, Florida hasn't really seen that many recent polls, but Donald Trump holds an advantage, and you can't really deny that. In my own personal prediction, regardless of what the polls say, Donald Trump is up by a pretty substantial amount. I expect him to win Florida by a likely margin. Florida joins Texas and Ohio, bringing Donald Trump and J.D. Vance to 218 electoral votes. Now, some, less surprising ones. We can actually take a look at Maine first and take a look at that individual congressional district. Donald Trump holds a margin. I guess that's not Maine. That is, maybe we can do some switch around here. Maybe if we refresh, we'll get to Maine. Maine's 2nd district is pretty good for Donald Trump. Of the recent polls, he's up by a likely margin, and there isn't really much in consideration here that district will go to the Democrats, just plainly put. When it comes down to the state of Nebraska, it's a bit of a flip case. Both the 2nd district, but Nebraska's 2nd, actually moves in a way that is beneficial for the Democratic Party. So based on the data we're working with right now, Kamala Harris holds a likely margin in Nebraska's 2nd. For some reason, it's not loading, but I will have you trust me on this point, because when you look at the data, you can see Kamala Harris holds an advantage. 8, 9, 10, sometimes 12 points in a recent poll we saw out of the 2nd district. Substantial for Kamala Harris. Now, moving over to the next state here, the state of New Hampshire, Kamala Harris holds a 5-point advantage in this state. So this is actually the first time we've seen New Hampshire move down to being a lean Democratic state rather than a likely Democratic state. So for a while, New Hampshire had been this state where Kamala Harris held a pretty substantial advantage. To be fair with you, right, it is just one poll that really skews it down. The rest of them say it's at a likely margin. Dartmouth has it 21. You have YouGov at Harris plus 7. St. Anselm, which is typically quite accurate, has it at Harris plus 5. So maybe some reduction relative to 2020. But again, looking at the margins here, and also when you look at 22, it's really interesting when you look at the polls there, because they far overestimated Republican support. But as of right now, Kamala Harris at a 5-point margin, just on the cusp of being a likely state, moves down to the lean column. And Minnesota, that's the last one before we get to the core 7. Minnesota, Kamala Harris up by 5.8%. So a bit of reduction of support compared to 2020. But at large here, these states are still staying within the boundaries of being likely Democratic states, the exception here being New Hampshire, but only narrowly the exception. And so now we're down to the remaining 93 toss-up electoral votes. And I'm sure you knew it was going to come to this, that, we weren't at a point where there was certainty around any of these states. The polls here will throw you for a loop. The data we are working with shows a disconnect between how some swing states are voting and other swing states are voting, when generally speaking, based on their margins in 2020, I'm actually quite baffled by some of these results, right? You have found states that have voted very similarly in the last election are further apart now than they were then. And it even just goes to show that what appeals to voters in one cycle may not appeal to voters in the next cycle. What is, swaying portions of the electorate then may not sway portions of the electorate now. And it really does come down to, who is going to be at a position of who can win across the board. Who can appeal to the voters in rural Wisconsin as well as urban Georgia? Who can appeal to the voters in suburban North Carolina and college towns in Nevada? And in some cases, you will find Kamala Harris does well. Some cases you will find Donald Trump does well. But no candidate as of right now is leading in all 7 battleground states. This is, very different than 2020, where we started to see some different things pop up. But honestly speaking, it's a really close race, and it's a really fun one to watch. But so far, really, really competitive election. So, 93 toss-up electoral votes. Let's get started. Let's start off with the states that are a bit more out there in favor of individual candidates. Arizona is a perfect example. Donald Trump holds a 2.1% lead in the state. Now, I am still reminded that Kari Lake was supposed to be governor should the polls be correct, that Blake Masters should have been a 6-year term senator from Arizona. Didn't happen. And the reason it didn't happen was because we missed the mark on something in Arizona. We missed the mark on voters that cared a lot about abortion in a way that we did not expect many voters to turn out based on what we were seeing in issues like the economy and the southern border and gas prices. All of these things that came into these compounding factors as to what we thought would matter to the American public and did matter to them according to the polls ended up being a little bit different than how people actually voted and why they voted on Election Day in 22. Just something I think about. I also am reminded that in 2020, Biden was supposed to win Arizona by 3 points. He only won it by 0.3 points. Massive reduction based on what the polls had said. Sure, they predicted the eventual winner correctly, but they also underestimated the former president. I don't know where we're at in the polls, but I'm not here to argue with them. I'm here to display them and analyze them based on what they're telling us. Right now, they say Donald Trump wins the state by a lean margin. My actual prediction, I still have Donald Trump winning it, just by a slightly less amount. But Arizona and its 11 electoral votes go to Donald Trump nonetheless. Georgia's in a similar camp. While the results here are a bit better than where they were 2 weeks ago for Kamala Harris, it's not at a point where it has tightened up just yet. Georgia right now, Kamala Harris is down against Donald Trump 1.5% across the state. Georgia, Arizona, Donald Trump holds the advantage. Boost him up to 246 electoral votes. It really isn't that shocking that we've seen the general trend across many of these states. New Hampshire is a good example. Minnesota is a good example. How we've seen slight reductions in support from the last cycle. Sure, the investments in the states aren't as strong, and that makes sense. But for a state like Georgia and Arizona to be shifting roughly on par is a general indicator that, hey, wait a minute. Donald Trump's in a good position relative to the last cycle. A good position is enough to win the election. And maybe the margins can shift enough here that Donald Trump actually wins the states, enough to reach 270 electoral votes. That's yet to be seen, but so far, he's off to a good start. North Carolina is the next state to look at, where Donald Trump, if we can actually get the numbers here, should be leading in this state by roughly a point. There is something really off today about me getting to the data points across the state, the 538 website here. But if you can just zoom in right here, you'll see the North Carolina, Donald Trump holds just the narrowest advantage here, roughly 1 point across the state. Not substantial enough to say, this is a massive victory for Donald Trump. If anything, it's actually a reduction in support compared to the last cycle. But even then, North Carolina, regardless, still that tough nut to crack for Democrats, still don't crack it in 2024. 16 electoral votes to Donald Trump and his campaign. And so now we're down to Nevada, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. And I actually want to do Nevada first and then move to the Rust Belt so we can talk about those three states together. Nevada, as of right now, Donald Trump holds a 0.4% advantage. Now, not necessarily the best trend line here. It is a lot skewed by the Susquehanna University poll that shows Donald Trump with a 6-point advantage across the state. Keep in mind that we had seen in previous cycles that they had predicted that Adam Laxalt, the Republican nominee for Senate, would win by 5. He ended up losing across the state. So right now, sure, Donald Trump holds that upper hand. I will say that Nevada's a pesky one, and I say this every cycle because Nevada consistently overestimates Republican support, and I wouldn't be shocked if that trend continued because it started in 2008, 2010, 2012, 14, 16, 18, 20, 22, and potentially, if it continues and keeps up, 24. So eye on that one. Right now, though, Donald Trump stayed according to the polls. And so in the remaining 44 toss-up electoral votes, what we know about the blue wall, red wall, whatever you want to call it, these are three states that have voted together since 1988. They have never once deviated in a way that just simply, they just don't change. Wisconsin will vote the same way as Michigan, and Michigan will vote the same way as Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania will vote the same way as everybody else. These three states have voted together, with each other, and this cycle, that might break apart, at least according to the polls. Take a look at what we see in the state of Michigan. Kamala Harris holds a 1-point advantage. That's good for the Democratic campaign. It's less than it was in 2020, again, on par with some of the reductions in some other battleground states, but it's still a victory nonetheless. But it isn't enough. It is never enough because Michigan alone cannot put Kamala Harris over the finish line. What about Wisconsin? Actually an improvement off the 2020 margin, a bit different than what you might expect. Okay, Wisconsin goes to Kamala Harris by 0.8%. Where does that put her? 251 to Donald Trump's 268. So where does it come down to? Well, as we can expect, and I'm sure you did expect, the battleground state of Pennsylvania, that at headline is a tie, but in actual margin is a narrow Donald Trump victory in the state. 0.2%, putting him at 287 electoral votes. The polls here right now tell us that Donald Trump is doing well compared to 2020, phenomenally better than 2020. Does perform worse than the 2016 election, but it's a race that Donald Trump wins nonetheless. Now, the polls here go to show the Democrats, as much as they seem to be enthusiastic and confident they will win, the data says Donald Trump has the election. Does it say he has it by a lot? Absolutely not. Pennsylvania being 0.4%, that's not anything really in the grand scheme of things. That is well within the margin of error. Margin of error is typically 3.5%, which means it really could go either direction. Though the aggregate says Donald Trump holds that narrow advantage. In Nevada, we see the same thing. 0.2% advantage, very narrow advantage for the Trump campaign in that battleground state. Is it enough to say that, Donald Trump will be guaranteed to win it? Absolutely not. Meaning that, in theory, Kamala Harris, just outperforming her current polls by just 1 percentage point, would win the election. Same thing for Donald Trump. It's really interesting. This is a cycle at which, a 1% difference in the polls can make all the difference between the election winner. That was not the case in 16. That was not the case in 20. That was not the case in 12. That was not the case in 2008. Quite frankly, it was not even the case in 2004. It was only the case in 2000 and 2024. And so nearly a quarter of a century apart, we are back. We are back to competitive races in a way that we just simply haven't seen before. This cycle is one for the history books for a variety of different reasons. And based on the polls today, across all 50 states and in every battleground state, the aggregates say Donald Trump wins the election 287, Kamala Harris 251. A very close race, but Republicans victorious nonetheless. Let's see over the next 4 days if the polls will be proven right or wrong on Election Day and what that means for the future in understanding and dissecting election information and predicting elections using this data that might be entirely right or entirely wrong with only time to tell. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the top left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.